We like, generally, to have a predictable life so that we can go home from doing all of our exciting activities and we can relax and we can feel safe and we can be around familiar things. So that's predictability, and our snakes and other reptiles really appreciate predictability and routine in their life. But now, what about when you feel like doing something different and you go see a movie, you go to an amusement park, you go to a swimming pool, you take a helicopter ride, you go bungee jumping, you go horseback riding. That's enrichment. Okay? So your reptiles appreciate a little bit of enrichment too, both enrichment objects and enrichment experiences. So object enrichment is giving them something to play with, so to speak, giving them something new to climb on. Haley, can you hold that up? So I just bought that before the presentation for my little snake here, and she's never seen it before. And so it's novel to her. It means it's new. It's something she's never seen before. Now clearly, she is what we call neophilic, which means attracted to novelty, attracted to new things. She's not fearful of this. Look at her. She's investigating it. She's going right to it. That's not the case with every reptile that you get, and certainly not with every snake you get. Some are neophobic, which means new things just scare the heck out of them, and it takes them a really long time to get used to new stuff you give them. So enrichment is only enrichment until it becomes old hat, until they become familiar with it. Until, hey, I've climbed on this 100 times now. I like it, I like climbing on it, but it's not exciting and new and stimulating anymore. I need something else. So if you have one of those shy reptiles or one of those really shy snakes, I'm not going to say it, but royal pythons, okay, I work with them too. We have a lot of those in my behavior lab. They tend to be shy. They tend to be neophilic. If I give them an enrichment item, for the most part, it's going to take them a really long time to engage with that enrichment item. Whereas Morelia Bredli tend to be really resilient, really curious and just wanting to engage in new and novel things like she just did. She has never seen that before. So for her, that's a great enrichment item until she gets used to it. So an enrichment experience then would be something that we do for our reptile that is not an object that we put in their enclosure, but an experience that we let them engage in, like animal training. Or like letting them out of their enclosure and taking them out in the sunshine safely, not frying them in the sun, but walking outside for a few minutes and bringing them back in. Or we put them in maybe a room that's snake-proof, if it's a bigger snake. If it's a small snake, maybe you put them in a mesh exercise tent that they can't get out of, and you let them explore empty boxes and new scents and new textures and objects safely. But if you have one of those snakes or other reptiles that's shy, some lizards can be quite shy as well, you don't want to force these experiences on them. You kind of want to gauge your reptile and figure out if it's something you think they would like or not. So that's going to lead us into training as enrichment. Now I use training for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons that I train the snakes and other reptiles is for enrichment. Because in the wild, they have a lot of energy, brain energy and physical energy that they have to use to survive. Because they have to leave their burrow, or their tree, or their rock crevice, or their cave, or they have to unbury from under the ground, and they have to go and search out resources. Who knows what some of those resources are that a snake has to find in the wild? Just shout it out. Food, is that what you said? Heat? Yes, they have to thermoregulate. Water, food, mates, food. They have to go find stuff. Okay, if you guys in the back that had your hands up, just yell out what you were going to say. Okay, Mom's saying no.
He's okay.
All right, so they have to go find this stuff, and they have to acquire it. They have to figure out, how can I get this prey item and subdue it and capture it and eat it safely? How can I avoid being predated upon on my journey there to get my food or to get this drink of water or to thermoregulate? How can I stay safe, avoid predation? How can I find mates? How can I find meals? How can I find stuff? They have to do a lot of problem solving and figuring stuff out and managing their environment. And then they have to find their way back home. So they're good at problem solving. They have to be or they wouldn't survive. But what happens when we bring them into captivity now? And they don't have to do that stuff, right? Because don't we give them everything? So now we have them in captivity. And we give them everything. We give them their food, we give them their water, we give them, hopefully, the ability to thermoregulate. And what do they do with that energy that is meant to do something else with? Well, if we don't give them proper outlets for that energy, they're going to start to exhibit stereotypies. Now, does anybody know what a stereotypy is? And if you visit zoos a lot, you've probably heard about stereotypical behavior in zoos. What's something that would be a stereotypy in a zoo animal that you can think of?
Pacing.
Pacing. Pacing is the #1 stereotypy for zoo animals. They want to be free. They want to roam. They have all of this innate energy and these urges built up that they would be using in the wild that they don't need to use here in their habitat. And so if we don't give them a healthy outlet for that energy, they do things like pacing, like pawing. Snakes and other reptiles do things like glass surfing, nose pushing, nose rubbing, sometimes hyperactivity around the interior of the enclosure called edging. We really don't want them to do that because some of that behavior can be self-injurious. So what do we do instead? Let's give them stuff to do. Let's give them enrichment, but let's also train them. Because now that's a way that we can teach them to communicate with us, we can communicate with them, we can give them an outlet for that energy, and we can teach them really useful stuff. Okay. So if you are wondering at this point who I am, I'm going to go there, and then we're going to go right into training, and I'm going to give you a definition. So my name is LoriTorrini. I'm a certified animal behaviorist and trainer. I have a degree in zookeeping and a degree in animal health and behavior. I have over 35 years experience working with all different species of animals, doing training, behavior consulting, enrichment activities, habitat design, animal emergency response. If you're here from here in Colorado, I deployed on both the Waldo Canyon fire and the Black Forest fire in 2012 and 2013. I was the animal emergency response branch director for the Waldo Canyon fire. So we set up a small animal emergency evacuation shelter, and we had reptiles in that shelter. We had dogs, cats, we had all kinds of animals in that shelter. I've also done veterinary assisting. Right now, I'm the director of behavioral husbandry at Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary, which is just outside of Colorado Springs. And then I run my own animal training and behavior business, Behavior Education, LLC. I have a YouTube channel. I also have a Patreon where I do a learning platform of additional classes and courses and booklets, etc. So I got asked to talk about animal training today at the Expo, and it's super exciting to be able to talk to you about snake training and reptile training, because I've been training other animals for years, and it's really reinvigorated my passion for training to find out how fun and easy it is to train snakes and other reptiles, and how well they take to it and how quickly they learn. So let's talk about what learning is. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the process of learning skills needed to do a particular job or activity. That's what training is. It's just learning. You learn stuff all the time. Sometimes we learn stuff inadvertently, and sometimes we teach others things we wish we hadn't accidentally taught them to do. I'm sure you can think about circumstances with maybe your own reptile or your dog or your kids, where, gosh, you know what, I taught them to do that and I wish I hadn't done that. I like to think of training as guided learning, okay? Is guiding the animal to learn how to do something, or to learn the meaning of something, or just how to interact appropriately in a human manufactured world, because these animals did not evolve to live in a high-rise apartment or in your house or in a zoo or in a classroom. They evolved to live out in the desert or the forest or the ocean. Okay, so we have to help them learn how to behave in our human world, inside our house, inside a zoo, inside a lab, inside a classroom. Okay? inside an educational environment like this, she's learning right now. What are some things that this Brettles python is learning right now? This is her first experience away from her breeder, outside of a rack, a breeding rack, and outside of a deli cup at an expo. What are some things she has learned just in the 2 hours I've been interacting with her? Can you think of anything that she's learned today?
New sounds.
She's learned new sights, new sounds. Hopefully she's learned I'm not a threat, because you saw that she was relaxed as she was climbing on me. However, it was interesting when some other people went to try to pet her, she turned away from them and climbed back on me. So she learned pretty quickly what was familiar and safe, and what maybe was strange and new and she didn't want anything to do with. Now what is she learning? She's learning how to interact with this log, this branch, which I guarantee she's never been exposed to before. So I'm not deliberately teaching her anything, but by allowing her this free exploration and giving her a little bit of choice and control, she is learning how to interact in our world. And she's getting used to all of you in this educational setting. Okay. All right, a good example of how we want to teach our reptiles to become familiar with stuff is at some point, what if they have to go to the veterinarian? What if you have to evacuate? What if they have to go to a shelter? What if their enclosure just breaks and you have to temporarily put them in a new one? What if you have company and new people they're not used to? The more you can train them or guide them to learn to get used to stuff in a non-emergency situation, the more low stress an emergency situation is going to be. So if I have placed a stethoscope in my snake's enclosure or in their exercise space and just tossed it in there and let them interact with it if they choose, let them touch it, let them smell it, let them tongue flick at it, let them crawl around it, it's just going to be nothing unusual to them. And we go to the vet, and the vet listens to the snake's heart with a device that the snake is 100% comfortable with because they have it at home. So that's something that's not going to frighten them. It's going to reduce their stress level at the vet, which is a strange new place. So we want to teach them in a really low stress, non-emergency way to become familiar with anything that they may be likely to encounter throughout their lifetime. What are some things that you can think of that a reptile that can live 20 or 30 years might have to encounter during their life? Can you think of some stuff? Moving, car rides, yes? Bigger things, just new objects in general. All of these things are likely to happen. So if we can slowly and gradually get them used to it in a situation where it's not, well, we have to do this right now, we can do that without stressing them out. Of course, reptiles can be trained. I always get asked that. Can reptiles be trained? Yes, they can be trained. Okay. Cognition is just the process that vertebrates go through to learn and remember and store information for use later on. Reptiles can do that. All vertebrates have advanced nervous systems that include the brain and the spinal cord and our central nervous system, which produces neurochemicals. Snakes and other reptiles are vertebrates. Sometimes people forget that, okay? So they have the same or homologous brain structures as other vertebrates, despite what you may hear in popular culture, right? And what I mean by the same or similar, I want you to think of an airplane and a helicopter. Can everybody knows what an airplane and a helicopter looks like, yes? Just shout it out, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
They both fly, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do they both achieve lift the same way?
No.
No, because they look totally different. The helicopter achieves flight through those rotors on top. Yeah, you got it. An airplane achieves flight how? With the wings. So that's how I want you to think about vertebrate brain structure. They're not all exactly structured the identical way, but all of the cells in the vertebrate brain are the same and function in the same way on a cellular level. So birds and reptiles have this brain area called the dorsal ventricular ridge that neurologists think is the same as our neocortex. And if you've heard of the neocortex, that's the part that does all the higher functioning, the cognition, the learning, the object permanence, which is, I know you're sitting there, and if he held a sheet up in front of you, I know you're still sitting there. That's object permanence. So those kinds of things. So yes, reptile brains can do all of that stuff. Snakes, of course. Let's talk about how learning occurs here. So when we learn, and when your snake learns, first there's an antecedent, or a stimulus. Something happens, right? So let's say that we're walking out in the parking lot today, and there's a huge pothole that filled up with water from all that water we got yesterday. So there's a huge pothole with like basically a mud puddle. But we haven't learned what that is yet, and we're just walking along and we step in it. And it's now our feet are soaking wet, and maybe we even slip and fall. And we get up and we move on. So that puddle was the stimulus, was the antecedent. It's the thing that came first. And then there was a behavior or an action that took place. What did we do? We stepped in it. And what was the consequence to that action? We got really wet, or we fell. What did we learn from that?
Don't step in the puddle.
Correct. So that's how learning occurs for your snakes and other reptiles and all of your animals. Something happens, they behave in a certain way, and based on their behavior, there's an outcome, there's a consequence. And if that consequence is bad, they're not likely to repeat that behavior they just did. If that consequence is good, then they're likely to do that same behavior over and over again. So if your dog jumps on you and then you pet them and they like to be petted, they're going to continue to jump on you. So we inadvertently are able to teach our animals sometimes things that we don't mean to teach them. So a really important rule in animal training is reinforce the behaviors you want and ignore the behaviors you don't want. Because if you don't want an animal to repeat a behavior, you need to ignore it and make sure you're not inadvertently reinforcing it. This probably goes for kids too, those of you who are parents. All right, we talked a little bit about guided learning, and there's lots of ways that we can guide snakes and other reptiles to learn. First, we want to give them a choice-rich life. And we want to give them lots of stimulation and an enriched environment. Lots of just complexity, things for them to investigate, to seek out, to learn about. Like we're doing with this Brettles python right here. Okay. She came from a pretty, now in behavior science, when we say deprived, we don't mean like substandard, getting starved and neglected. A deprived environment is just one that doesn't have a lot of, doesn't have stimulation. That's how that's defined in behavior science. So she came from a deprived environment. She lived in a rack, which is something breeders tend to raise snakes in, that had like paper on the bottom and a water dish. And now she's been moved today into a stimulating and enriched environment. And just that in itself, she's learning things. We already talked about that. We can also help guide them to learn by monitoring their stress levels. If I saw that her stress level was skyrocketing, I would remove her from this situation and put her someplace that she felt comfortable and safe. We can do this through passive and active habituation. That's what I talked about with the stethoscope. That's passive habituation. We put something in with the reptile and we just let them be around it. At their own time, they can choose to interact with it or not, and over time they get used to it. If you do that, you want to put it where it doesn't interfere with access to resources. So you don't put the new object that the snake or lizard might be scared of where they, in a place where they can't access their water or their heat or their hide. Okay? Active habituation is we're helping the animal along. We're kind of facilitating them to interact with new things and get used to stuff, and training is the way that we can do that. We can teach them to discriminate between safe, not safe, food, not food. What one signal means, we can teach them, this signal means I'm going to touch you, this signal means I'm going to feed you, this signal means I'm going to open your door. We can teach them that through classical conditioning. And that's a type of learning where one stimulus is paired with another. So I pair the bell with food. Now you hear the bell, you think food. Bell, food. Target, food. Target, food. That's why I use the snakes at first. And then operant conditioning is where now the signal no longer means you're going to automatically get food for free. Now you got to work for it. So now you have to operate on your environment. You have to behave in some way now in order to earn the food, earn your paycheck, okay? Earn your freedom. So classical conditioning is simply this signal means something's going to happen, and your behavior doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you throw a tantrum. If I say dinner's ready, you're still going to get fed. But in operant conditioning, if I say dinner's ready, now I'm going to expect you to do something to earn that first. Okay? And these are just different ways that we train. Things that people get confused about in training is positive means adding something to the training circumstance, and negative means removing something from the training circumstance. Okay? So positive reinforcement is I'm giving you a paycheck, I'm giving the snake food, I'm giving the turtle some lettuce. Negative reinforcement is I'm taking something away that you don't like. So let's say you're too cold, I take away the cold, and now you're happy. So anytime something's reinforcing, that's good. It means it's good, and it's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to repeat that behavior because you found the consequences reinforcing. Negative reinforcement just means I'm taking away something that you don't like. All right? Negative punishment and positive punishment are the opposite. It means I'm doing something to you or adding something to the situation that you don't like. So positive punishment is I pinch you and you don't like it. So whatever you did to make me pinch you, you're not going to do again, probably. Okay? Negative punishment is I take your paycheck away. You did something I don't like, so I'm not going to pay you today. I'm not going to feed you today. I'm not going to do this thing you like today. And these are ways that we help animals learn. So the history of reptile training, people have been training reptiles since like the 1970s, and some of the early training probably wouldn't pass ethical review today, like taking fully aquatic water snakes and trying to train them to navigate a terrestrial maze like a mouse would run in. So this is why it's important that we consider the species we have, and we look up their natural history and their natural biology. What are things they would naturally do in the wild? What do they normally eat? How do they perceive the world? What senses do they use? Do they use their eyesight? Do they use their hearing? Do they use their taste? We need to know all these things so that we can set up an appropriate training environment that's going to make sense to the learner. It wouldn't make sense to you if I dropped you out of an airplane and said, fly, because you are not a species that possesses the ability to fly. So why would I try to train you in flight? Okay? We wouldn't take a fish and put him in a terrestrial maze that a mouse runs and expect them to be able to navigate that. So you want to make sure you're looking at your species' natural history and that you set up the training so it's going to make sense to them. So I'm going to give you some examples now from my program, if this video plays, which I haven't been having luck. I had to go to YouTube before. This is a training session. So I do some training live. Like Kaylee here, her husband has hired me to train his dog. So I go to their house and we do dog training there. Or I hold dog training classes and people bring their dogs. But I also do a lot of training remotely over Zoom. So I am talking in this video to one of my clients who's in another state. She's not even in Colorado. She's doing a target training session with her snake, and while she is training her snake, I am coaching her as to what to do. I'm telling her to reposition that tree because it didn't make sense where the branch was that she had it for the snake to come out on. I'm telling her how quickly to move the target. I'm watching the snake's behavior and I'm guiding her to change the position of her tools based on the snake's behavior. And what she just wants, she's teaching him to come out of the enclosure on cue. And he's really a beginning learner right now. And so her goal in this session was just to have him come out onto that snake tree and over that first branch. And so I'm guiding her as to how to do that. This is a really simple behavior, but this is what an actual training session looks like when I'm working with someone virtually. And so then I'm telling her, okay, that was your goal. That was your training plan, was to get him that far. He's out on the tree. So sometimes I have to remind clients, that was your plan. Now don't keep pushing it, because that's when we get into trouble. So reinforce now. So I told her to reinforce, she did, and he took the food. Okay. And so in incremental steps then, we're gonna teach him to come further and further and further out until he shifts all the way out of the enclosure, basically when we ask him to. Why would we wanna do that? Why would we just not grab the snake out of the enclosure and say, come with me?
Because that could be scary.
Yeah, how scary would that be if I came into your house and burst into your front door and grabbed you out of your house and said, we're going to the amusement park today, we're gonna ride a roller coaster. You would be like, I never wanna see you again. But what if I knock on your door and ask you, hey, do you wanna come out and let's go to a movie, let's go to the amusement park, let's go take hiking. That's totally different. Hopefully you guys see that. So when we intrude into our reptile's enclosure and we yank them out, how scary, how stressful, how intrusive that we ask them to come out and they just come out. Now any experience that follows is hopefully going to be positive for all of us. Now this is a more complicated behavior. This animal, Merlin, is an inland carpet python, and I've had him for 5 years, I think, and I've been training him since day one, and that's a question I get all the time. When can I start training my snake or my lizard or my frog? I have a client that's training 2 Pac-Man frogs. And I say, if they're eating, they can be training, because the first step in this is pairing the target with food. First, we just want them to associate the target with food. And then we want them to look at the target and then they get the food. And then we want them to follow it a few inches and then they get the food. Then we want them to follow it to the door and then they get the food. Then we want them to follow it out the door and then they get the food. Then we want them to follow it onto, this is a scale, and then they get the food. But he's 5 feet long. I need him not just to come out and touch that scale, I need his whole body on that scale. So then I teach him, now you're not just getting the food for coming out, now you're getting the food for following the target until I tell you we're done. And then you get the food. So he has learned this over time in small baby steps to get to the point where he can do this entire behavior. And those are called approximations. Each little step in animal training is called an approximation. So what I'm asking him to do is follow the target until I tell him we're done. And I tell him that by flattening the target, changing its position from vertical to horizontal. That's what I've taught him means, okay, that's the end of the behavior, you can stop now. See how I flatten it? And then he should pause and then wait for me to give him the food. And now he is 100% on the scale for me to weigh him. And I didn't have to force him out. I didn't have to intrude into the enclosure. I didn't have to get him in my hands and try to squish him onto the scale, because he did this voluntarily. He chose to do this. And this gave him mental enrichment, right? It gave his brain something to do. It gave his body physically something to do. He had to work for that the way he would have to work for it in nature. So it created a challenge for him in a captive setting for those innate behavioral urges, for that energy that he doesn't really have to use to find food, but we're creating it for him. So it's an outlet for that natural behavior of, I have to go hunt and find my food and figure out how to get to it, how to acquire it, and then eat it. So we call this cooperative care training, and it's a very, very low stress management technique. So it means that we are teaching the snakes to voluntarily cooperate in their own care. Like, I taught him to weigh himself. I basically taught him to do that, so it was not stressful for him, it was not stressful for me, and it was safe for both of us. So cooperative care is very much based in the animals choosing to participate. They are voluntarily participating in this, which is why it's so important we lay some groundwork first. with the enrichment, with the passive habituation, with the just letting them get used to environments before we start interacting with them like this, because we don't want them to be afraid of us or the training environment. When we get to this point, we want them to already be used to us and not be afraid of us, and be used to at least the environment where they're training. We want all of the interactions to be choice-based. Consent and agency are big in cooperative care. Consent is meaning the lizard is consenting to allow you to touch them or do something to them. And agency is perceived control. So there's a really good paper if you want to learn more about how innately reinforcing freedom is to life, to all organisms, even bugs and fish and our reptiles, not just mammals. But freedom is naturally, innately reinforcing. We find freedom to choose. We find that rewarding. And we find constraint and confinement and restrictions aversive. We don't like that, neither do our reptiles. Agency is perceived control, because we know that our reptiles are under captive management. Even if she's loose in this room, she's still a captive. But by letting her choose to be on that log or not, or crawl on Kaylee's arm or not, or crawl on me or not, and move around, it gives her a sense of agency or perceived control. She feels like she has a sense of control, and we all like that. I mean, basically we give up some control to live in society, but we have perceived control because we can still make a ton of decisions on our own. We use the least intrusive principles, so that just means like the least intrusive, minimally aversive. So if I have to accomplish care on my reptile, what's the least intrusive way that I can do that? And this is one I get from clients all the time. The enclosure needs cleaned. The whole enclosure needs cleaned, or the snake just went to the bathroom and it's driving you crazy because you feel like you need to clean it out. Wait for an opportune time. Wait until the snake comes out on their own and you can clean that without bothering them. Wait until the snake's in their hide and just cover the entrance to the hide, clean, and then uncover the entrance to the hide. That's the least intrusive that you can be to clean that. Okay? What's the minimally aversive thing that you can do if you have to accomplish care? Like I have to evacuate, I have to go to the vet, it's kind of an emergency. But what's the least aversive thing I can do to the reptile so that they're going to experience the lowest amount of stress during that interaction? And I had a client whose snake was trained with a shift. Like I train a lot of mine with targets, but she trained hers to shift into a bin. So she would set the bin next to the enclosure instead of using a target, and she gradually taught the snake to shift automatically into the bin. And they had to evacuate during a flood, and her husband was home by himself with the dog and the snake. And he was trying to grab the snake out, and it was getting away, and it anchored around something, and he couldn't get it. And the place was flooding, and the ceiling was falling in. And she told him on the phone, set her shift bin next to the tank. And he went and got the bin. The snake saw the bin and automatically shifted into the bin. So that was a real life emergency where that snake, having learned that previous behaviors, came in handy. So least intrusive, minimally aversive, or what's the least intrusive, most effective I can be in this circumstance. And that's going to vary for animals, because a highly trained animal like Merlin, the inland carpet python, I mean, if we have an emergency, I can grab that target and he's going to follow me. But if he just got there that day and he has no training yet, well, maybe the least intrusive, most effective thing I can do to evacuate is I have to grab him out because he doesn't know anything yet. So it's going to vary based on where your animal's at. And then we use classical and operant conditioning, which I already talked about a little bit, and positive reinforcement training. So you can use food, you can use freedom, anything the animal likes, you can use as a paycheck, as a reward. If you guys have questions, shout them out. We already talked a little bit why we don't want to just force the snake out, but ultimately this improves safety for everybody and it keeps the situation minimally stressful. So I'm going to show you another demonstration. I have a lot of infographics and stuff that I give to my students and my clients that are available, some for free and some on Patreon. This is just an example that illustrates classical conditioning. If I pair, well, first of all, in slot 1 here, the snake doesn't need to be told the food's reinforcing. Food is naturally reinforcing. Who doesn't like to eat? Okay, we find food naturally reinforcing because we have to eat to survive. So the snake automatically hunts when food's available. The snake automatically does nothing when the target's present, because it's just a thing that's there. They might be afraid of it, they might be curious about it, but it doesn't mean anything to them. But now we pair the target with food over and over and over and over and over again, and then what happens when they see just the target? Suddenly now they get an ambush hunting position because they associate the target with food. And so they see the target and they're hunting. They're ready to hunt because they know food's coming. That's classical conditioning. And that's how we start. But then we teach them down the road, hey, you're not automatically getting the food anymore. Now you got to start doing some stuff for it. You got to work for that paycheck. So this video does look like it's playing. So this is early stages. Did you see her behavior? I'll play that again, if it lets me. So watch her behavior as soon as she sees the target. Look at that. She was looking at me, but then as soon as she saw the target, she went to the target and then she got reinforced. So that's basically one of the first steps.
Is there a risk with having them come out of the enclosure and then taking their meal and then putting them back into the enclosure? Are you waiting till they like swallow it, or?
So in her case, she was already still in her enclosure,
Right.
so I just shut the door. But like with Merlin, he was all the way out. No, sometimes I'll target them back in. Like he had a small enough food item
Gotcha.
during that training session that if I needed to reinforce him a second time, I had one ready.
Okay.
And that's something that, depending on your species, and I work with a veterinarian, we make sure that their meals are appropriate. We don't feed them extra or more frequently or more food for training. We do the training around their normal meals, but sometimes instead of feeding him like a medium rat or a adult rat, I'll feed him 2 mice, or I'll feed him, 3 smaller things.
And are you waiting for him to like swallow it before he goes back in the enclosure?
So there's 2 things I do.
Okay.
If I'm in a hurry, while he's eating, I'll just pick him up and put him back in the
Okay.
enclosure while he's eating.
Got it.
But if your snake is not used to, and he's used to that, that's something you have to build up to. It's often a way I introduce touch is when they're eating. Will they freak out if I touch them while they're eating? And if not, I'll practice picking them up, moving them back to the enclosure, and it also helps them get used to my touch. So he's totally used to that, whatever. He's eating and I pick him up and put him back in. If I have time, I can target him back in. In fact, I did that with him in this session. So he finished eating, I now put the target in the enclosure and I had him come back in. Okay, so you can do that. Sometimes I let them free roam after the meal, and in that case, I either wait for them to go onto something I can lift up and put back, or if it's a snake like Merlin, who I've had a long time, he's used to me, we have a relationship, I can just pick him up and put him away. But if your snake is not to that point yet, I wait for them to go in a hide, like a cardboard box, or wait for them to climb onto something I can pick up and move. So then I'm not stressing them out. Here's another example. I always recommend a handling cue. Some cue that means this happens, I'm gonna touch you. A lot of people, I do use a snake hook for some of my snakes. For a couple of my snakes, I have something else that I use. An oven mitt. If I have the oven mitt on and I come towards you, it means I'm gonna pick you up. Most of my snakes, I use the hook. And I touch them with it, I pick them up. I touch them with it, I pick them up. I touch them with it, I pick them up. So pretty quickly they learn, oh, if I get touched with this, she's gonna pick me up. They may not like being picked up, but the predictability of knowing what's about to happen usually makes the situation okay. Versus just touching them suddenly when they didn't know that was about to happen, that causes a startle response. That causes a surprise, that's a surprise. And we don't, in general, like surprises, unless we deliberately put ourselves in a situation where we know that we're expecting a surprise. I do want to say here, because you will hear people say, I tap train my snake to let them know they're not getting fed. All right, I'm going to pick on Kaylee, because I know Kaylee. If I tap Kaylee on the shoulder, and then I give her a hug, and I tap Kaylee on the shoulder, and then I give her a hug. And I tap Kaylee on the shoulder, and then I give her a hug. What does she think the shoulder tap means?
A hug.
Is she thinking, oh, the shoulder tap means Lori's not gonna give me food, is not gonna give me water, is not gonna like make me get out of this chair, is not gonna kiss me, is not gonna, she's not thinking about the 1,000 things I didn't do in that moment. She's thinking shoulder touch means hug. So it's the same with your snake. Your snake doesn't think, oh, the snake hook means I'm not being fed. No, the snake hook means I'm gonna be picked up and touched and handled. So I just wanted to clear that up because I hear that a lot, and it's not how behavior in the brain works. We talked about predictability. It's the consistent repetition of an action, making it possible to know in advance what to expect. So I've already told you how we apply that with our reptiles. We want to balance predictability with enrichment. And I hope I made that clear in the beginning. Their overall general life routine should be predictable. That keeps stress levels low. And you want to intermix some enriching activities in there. Some stimulation from time to time. You don't live on a roller coaster. Okay, so operant conditioning is what you saw Merlin doing. Classical conditioning is what you saw that short clip of the other Bell's python doing. And the snake hook thing is classical conditioning. Hook means I'm getting picked up. Target means I'm getting fed. It doesn't matter how the snake behaves, the outcome's the same. But in operant conditioning now, their behavior does matter. So we have to transition from that somehow. Is this going to play? There we go. So now this is kind of what that transition starts to look like. He's not automatically getting fed, so he's like, oh, why didn't I get fed? Let me move closer to the target. And then he got fed. So now I've just taught him, okay, I have to move a little bit now. I'm not just automatically getting the food. I had to move a little bit closer to the target in order to get that meal. We can watch that again, I think. I'm not exactly sure how the controls in here work. I guess we're not watching that again. So this is one of my Bell's pythons at the vet. And I'm going to show you how we trained this behavior. This is that shifting behavior I told you that you basically saw Merlin do, where he shifted out of his enclosure and onto a station, and then he got reinforced. This is just to remind me to talk to you about emergencies and how this comes in handy. I already told you about one, but this snake got, this is an example of capturing. So capturing a behavior is when you wait for the animal to do the behavior on their own, and then you reinforce them for it. And then you teach them a word for it or a cue for it, and you kind of train it backwards. So in regards to, like, say, if it was my dog and I wanted to teach them to sit using capturing, I'm working, I'm doing dishes, whatever, I'm cleaning out the horse stall, and I see the dog sit, I walk over and give it a treat, and then I go back to what I'm doing. And then I see the dog sit again, and I go give it a treat, and I go back to what I'm doing. Pretty soon the dog realizes, oh, every time I sit, I'm getting paid. I'm gonna sit a lot more. And then I can start introducing a signal for them to do it, and then a voice command. And so you can capture behaviors with your snake as well. So here's an example of where I've just rolled a station up to the snake's enclosure and left the door open. And then went to my desk, which is not too far from here, and worked. And the snake came out on his own, eventually. I did this several days, and he came out on his own. Now, you could reinforce this with food. Sometimes I do. I didn't in this case, because he's being reinforced with freedom. The experience itself is reinforcing for him. How do I know it's reinforcing? Remember we talked about in the beginning? If something's reinforcing, what will happen?
We'll do it again.
The animal will repeat the behavior. So if he didn't repeat this behavior, I would know that he didn't like it, that he wasn't finding the experience reinforcing or rewarding. And then maybe I would introduce food to get him to start associating the experience with something rewarding. But I didn't have to, because he found this experience in itself rewarding. So he's being reinforced with freedom. And so this is an example of capturing the behavior. He's getting reinforced for doing this behavior on his own, And just like my client and her corn snake, after a certain amount of time, what happens when I place the station next to the enclosure? He automatically comes out because he was previously found that reinforcing. That's called capturing.
Is that a cat scratching post?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to reconnect my controller. Oh, I have tons and tons of references. You guys, I have pages and pages of references on reptile cognition and behavior. If you guys are looking for something in particular about reptile brain structure or animal behavior science or learning science in general, I probably have a reference for that because I've gone way back into the early 1900s through the present day. I also, I'm proud to say I published that paper about Borath doing that behavior at the vet, but a colleague of mine, actually two colleagues of mine, Michelle Williams and Dr. Zach Loafman, who's the head of zoo science at West Liberty University, we published a paper 2 years ago on doing cooperative shifting with false water cobras. So we took a group of 28 false water cobras that were in their zoo lab at West Liberty University and trained them to do this shifting behavior from their habitat onto a scale and back. And we got that published in a scientific journal. So, and it's open access, it's not one you have to pay for. Okay, so there's my contact information. What questions do you have for me? Yes.
You've gone over one of the, or a really good example of freedom as a form of reward or reinforcement. Are there other non-food
Yes.
reinforcements?
So she asked if there are other non-food reinforcers, and there are. Depending on, you gotta know your species and what that species is gonna find, likely to find reinforcing, likely to. Then you've gotta learn your individual animal. And what does my individual learner find reinforcing? So sometimes you have to do what we call preference testing. There's actually a scientific method to do preference testing, but you can just do it informally at home. And you can observe things that your snake, reptile, dog, cat, horse seems to like to engage with, and then start using that as reinforcement. So, for example, the opening of the door to the enclosure, many of my Bredl's pythons find that really reinforcing. And so I would start pairing the open door with a target, a different target than one I used with food. So each behavior, each thing you want to communicate should have a different signal. Whether that's a target or a light, I have a couple of snakes that I shine like a flashlight in front of their hide and they'll come out, and I reinforce that. So I had a separate training target that I would put near the door, and that would tell the snake the door is gonna open, and he'd go to that door. And his enclosure had two doors in front and one on top. And I practiced putting the target near the different doors, and he would go to whichever one the target was at, because he knew that's the door that was gonna open up. So what are things I've seen other people use as non-food reinforcers with reptiles? Access to water, if you have a species that likes to engage and interact with water or swimming. Access to favorite scents or substrates, access to heat, or even access to cool. Certain textures. I have a client who has is it a hognose snake that likes the fuzzy, she has this fuzzy thing that her hognose snakes likes to get in this little fuzzy cushy thing. And so that is very reinforcing for just that particular snake. So you have to learn your animal and what they find reinforcing, and then you start pairing that thing with whatever behavior it is you want them to do. Yes?
So we have a panther chameleon, and we have outside of his enclosure this big lattice set up with a bunch of bird things. He loves it. Should we start using that as he loves to
Yeah,
come
I
out.
would. So once you start getting them to come out, you do have to plan for how do I get them back in, which was a great question someone asked. So you either need to learn how to give them a cue to go back in, or give them something on that perch, on that station, that he's likely to climb onto that's small enough to put back in. Or like my bull snake has her shift box that she knows when I go in there I'm gonna be put back. Or your animal, your chameleon needs to be comfortable enough that they're not stressed by you touching them and picking them up and putting So that's something you have to gradually come up with a plan. And it may look different when you start than how it ends up. You know, maybe in the beginning, I pick the snake up while they're eating and put them back, because that's the least stressful way for them, because they're engaged in eating and they don't really care that I'm touching them. Whereas if I just walked up and touched them and they weren't doing anything else, they'd probably try to get away.
He doesn't care that we're touching him, but he knows he's going back,
Okay, and I run into that a lot, because animals, as much as you might have difficulty getting this into some reptile people's heads, they like their freedom. Like, they didn't choose to come into our homes and live in a cage. And if we left the doors open for long enough, they would all come out. And a lot of times, even the shy ones that have sometimes they just don't come out because they don't know any better. They've been raised their whole life in that circumstance, and anything new is scary. But once they come out and experience things, and they feel like, oh, that was pretty fun, or that was reinforcing, or I kind of like that, I noticed I had one carpet python that took 18 months of me opening the door and working for a few hours to finally come out. But once he did the first time, he constantly wants out now, like all the time, like let me out, let me out, let me out. So sometimes it just takes that little bit. So your relationship with your animal is going to change over time as they learn and you get more comfortable with each other.
Would it benefit him if we had a cue that we were gonna take him back in?
Yes.
So that it wasn't like
A surprise.
Yeah, I mean, with that.
I would.
Okay.
It could be an empty paper towel roll. I use that with one snake. Whatever makes sense for him and you to either touch him with or kind of start to slide under his feet to tell, and then that's the signal. Whatever it is, that's the signal that means I'm going to pick you up now and put you back in. So at least he knows what's about to happen and it doesn't come as a surprise. Because when we surprise animals is when we get bitten or have accidents happen. We scare them and they take off. If something's predictable, if they know what's going to happen, I mean, to put it in simple terms, they just don't freak out as much. Because, hey, I know what's going to happen, I might not like it, but okay. It's not a surprise, so I'm okay with it. Do you guys have other questions?
I do. Is it good to pair a verbal cue with reptiles like we do with dogs?
If your reptile has a good sense of hearing, and you need to know that about your reptile species, then yes, you can start pairing a sound cue with the behavior. This is why I said it's important to know how your reptiles perceive the world, or how your animals perceive the world. I use a lot of visual cues with my pythons, but that's not going to be appropriate for a blind snake or for some other snakes. You can use scent cues like lavender or vanilla on a cotton ball or a Q-tip as a cue. You can use vibration. I use a flashlight with two of mine instead of the plastic target. So whatever's going to work for your animal, and if they have a good acute sense of hearing and you can come up with one sound that you know they hear that you're only going to use for that behavior, then you can pair that with the sound. That's what a lot of marine mammal trainers use, is a whistle. Because the marine mammal is in the water far away and they need to communicate with them, so they use the whistle as a bridge to communicate. Do you guys have other questions? Because I love talking about this stuff. And feel free to contact me. I think I gave you my card, and I'm going to be here a little while at the Denver Lizard Ranch booth. That's where this snake belongs. Except she might be coming home with me now, because I always feel guilty sending them back to a traditional breeder that puts them in a rack. When now she's had this experience, she's been super cool to hang out with me today. I kind of feel like I owe her.
This question kind of, I feel like we've already covered a lot of like, what are some non-target options for this? But I guess my question is, because I've heard of like some concerns about, compare a certain colored target, and someone comes in wearing that same color, or.
It can happen. So I've only had that happen with I have a children's python, an Antaresia childrenii, and I didn't realize that it happened with him, because my other snakes, like my Brettles pythons, my corn snakes, my boa, they're really good at, it's just the target. it's this blue target. Now, I'm not saying they don't react to the color royal blue when I'm wearing it, or they see it on something else. They do, they kind of perk up and they look at it, and then you can tell the realization happens that, oh, that's not my target, and they go back to what they were doing. The children's python, though, no, anything blue, he's absolutely, in his mind, it's the color. So that's another thing you just have to learn about. I only have the one animal that's latched onto the color versus their individual target. Because if I have a blue shirt on or blue nitrile gloves, he'll go right to him and bite him. But that's the only snake I've had do that, but it can happen. So that's a great point, because you want to be sure what you're actually teaching your animal. Like, I thought I was teaching him the target, but what I actually taught him inadvertently and didn't realize what he was learning was the color. But all of my other snakes have been able to distinguish their target. And I even tested targets that weren't theirs to see if they would enter, and they don't. And I've got a couple of videos where you can see they're like looking at the target, but then I'll bring their target, and all of a sudden it's like that head snaps and they look at it. So they've been able to distinguish that. But if you run into an animal where it's clear that they're thinking, oh, the color is what I'm targeting, there are ways that you can manage that. I think I've talked about that probably in a video. If you Google or go to YouTube and look at children's pythons, I have some videos about him. I may have talked about that in one, because that's a situation that could come up. You know, maybe you've got 9 out of 10 animals that learn this way, and you're always going to have that outlier to learn something different than what you intended. And then you just have to work with that. You got to manage that. Yeah.
So I noticed that you were on the videos you were using blue targets, and it's kind of building off that. Is that just what you had on hand when you were making targets, or do you get better results with some colors than others?
Yeah, okay, so I try to research the reptile learner's visual capacity and what colors they can see. Like turtles and crocodilians can see red very well. Turtles in particular, for some reason, really respond to red. And so I have my clients with turtles use a red target. When I was initially 5-6 years ago researching snake vision, and it's still debatable, because there's conflicting studies that say they can see green, they can see blue. No, they can't see blue, but they can see green. They can see red, but so they have the color options in their eyes to perceive certain wavelengths of color. But we can't know subjectively how their brain is converting that color into meaning for them. So even though they have the color options to see red, maybe they're not seeing red as we would see red. We don't know that. And so Lauren Augustine, who was a reptile trainer at the National Zoo and later at the St. Louis Zoo, she came and spoke to some of my students. I had her as a guest speaker. And she said it's really important that, yes, you research what colors your reptile is likely to be able to see, but then also do some testing. Like, see what seems to be the most salient cue for them, the most noticeable. Like, what do they take the most notice of? And I noticed that bright royal blue is something they tend to just really notice, or lime green. Not like the same green as their trees or fake plants or foliage or real plants, but like bright fluorescent green. So I use a lot of fluorescent green targets and a lot of those bright blue targets, because I just think it whatever they're perceiving it as, it's contrasting enough with their normal environment that they are noticing it really well.
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
For breeders who like have the environments that aren't enriching, are there things that those breeders can do inside racks? Like,
Yes.
just switch out things, or?
So I have a playlist on my channel that I don't know that I have time to get to now, or that it's gonna let me even get to now, because my little mouse thing's not working and my touchpad I have turned off. If you go to my YouTube channel and go to the snake cognition playlist, there's 7 videos in there, I think. 2 of them talk about tub enrichment. Things that you can put into tubs to help give them a more enriched life and help. This is something I wish breeders would do, is more preparation for that animal to succeed in a home or wherever it's going. Because if you've raised the animal in a rack, you've raised it to succeed in a rack. And if it goes to a pet home, it's gonna be a huge abrupt change and a major shock to it. So if I have a client that's getting from a breeder that has a species that's less resilient than brettle. Brettles are so resilient, honestly, I usually put them straight away into an enclosure when I get them home. But a royal python, some other species, no way. I buy a tub, I set it up identical to how the breeder had it, even if it was just paper and a water bowl. And then I put him in there the first night, and then maybe the next day or two, I'll put a paper towel roll in, I'll put a hide in. I start adding enrichment to that, and then I put that whole tub into an enclosure, and I either take the lid off or I cut a hole in the top with a hole saw or something. So now the snake can come out when they feel comfortable and start exploring the bigger habitat, and it makes for a really smooth transition. Because if you abruptly change them from A to Z, some animals are gonna be super freaked out by that and super distressed because it's all they've ever known. And even though ultimately they're gonna have better opportunities in the habitat you wanna put them in, they're terrified of it. And it's, you know, if you can gradually transition them, great. Now, if you get an animal that already came from something where it was exposed to enrichment, then you can just put it probably straight into how you're gonna keep it. But there's a couple of videos in that playlist that talk about tub enrichment. I did one, and then a colleague, Bob Bledsoe, who raises royal pythons, he does a lot of enrichment for the babies he raises. He even starts target training some of them before they go to new homes. So he did a video that I included in my playlist. Honestly, even if breeders would open the tubs while they're cleaning and let the snakes look out and come out and roam around the room, I mean, research shows that even minimal amounts of exposure to stimuli are gonna help that animal gain resilience and be better able to problem solve in the future. Like one of that Brettles python, Boris, that did the behavior at the vet that we trained at home, he was 2 before I got him, and he had lived in a rack. And I know the breeder, and he's fastidious about cleaning, so all that was in there was the water dish and the paper. But he was so fastidious about cleaning that he changed that every day. And every day when he changed it, he said, oh yeah, that snake, because I said, this snake's like roaming around my house on day 1 and it's not really like scared of anything. Oh yeah, that one used to roam around my snake room when I was cleaning. So even though his living conditions were what we would consider barren, that breeder inadvertently was enriching him because he was cleaning every day. The snake was coming out and roaming around the reptile room, and that in itself gave him that personality where he was just straight away when he got to my house was like, I was trying to put him in quarantine and he was trying to go in exercise areas, you know. So it depends on the species and what, if anything, the breeder has done with them. Like how often do they open the tub? Do they ever take them out and let them free roam? Do they put anything in the tub? How often do they interact? If it's never, then yeah, that snake's gonna be more freaked out by everything.
Is, sorry if this is a bit specific, but if you have king snakes,
Uh-huh.
regular snakes, or just multiple of the snakes, is it okay to let them have enrichment areas? Like let's say you set up a play tent or something like that, and have them, you know, like, do you need to sanitize it so the king snakes
Okay.
aren't smelling snakes the whole
Oh, yeah, so I do have 2 king snakes, and I just see that, so I do sanitize the areas, but not in between every snake. If the snakes are in the same room, and they're using the same common area, I clean it, but not between every snake. I might clean it once a week, or every few days, or whenever I feel like it's dirty. And I just feel like my king snake and my bull snakes and those species that eat other reptiles, it's an enrichment for them, because they're smelling it. They're gonna smell it in the wild.
Yeah, okay.
So they're smelling it in the tent. Plus, they live in a room with other snakes already. And you need to watch your snake's behavior. And I have a cheat sheet over here about body language that's general. Like it can't fit every single species, but in general, most of the species we keep as pets, which are your king snakes, your milk snakes, your corn snakes, rat snakes, pythons, boas. If the snake is getting into the yellow and red zone, then that may be time to put them away or let them retreat. You don't wanna, it should be enriching but not stressful in a bad way. Good stress, so there are 3 kinds of stress. This is a whole nother class. There's good stress, tolerable stress, and bad stress. Good stress is, I'm having so much fun riding this roller coaster, riding this horse, bungee jumping. Tolerable stress is, I'm scared to death to go to the dentist, but I need my teeth done, so, and I'm not really, I'm just, or I'm scared to speak in public. But then after and I'm not, but say I am. But then after I do it, I feel good about myself. And I feel like I've grown and learned and I can do it better the next time. That's tolerable stress. You know, in the moment, it's not a happy experience, but in the long run, you learn and grow from that experience. What you want to avoid is toxic stress, which is so distressing that the animal can't cope. And that's going to have detrimental impacts down the road. And that's what the cheat sheet is kind of a guide for. Don't let the stress level reach that toxic level. So watch them when they're out, and if they start to get nervous or something's not looking right, remove them from the situation. And then I let only snakes of the same species out together in general at the same time. And I definitely don't let an Ophiophagous snake, one that eats other snakes, out with any other snakes ever. But sometimes I'll have my super dwarf retic and my Brettles out at the same time. But usually I have, you know, like 2 Brettles roaming, and then mostly I'll just have 1 snake out at a time. But I know Bob Bledsoe will put multiple royals in a playpen at once if they're babies. Like the baby ones, he'll put 4 or 5 in there to roam around and play. Corn snakes do pretty well as babies together, but then they want less to do with each other the older they get, because I did some social studies and some cohabitation studies. So again, that's variable. And in my enrichment class, we talk over, so there are 5 categories of enrichment. We'll just end with this. There's cognitive enrichment, dietary enrichment, there is physical enrichment, sensory enrichment, and social enrichment. And social enrichment you can't do with reptiles, but you have to know the species and what their behavior is going to be like with conspecifics, animals of the same kind, and with other species as well. So you can do social enrichment with reptiles, but if you're not super familiar with the species you're working with and their natural behaviors and social behaviors, I recommend working with a behaviorist to help you if you want to do that, or just don't do that kind of enrichment. All right, you guys.
Can't
Yeah.
social enrichment also be
Yeah.
you?
Anytime one animal is interacting with another, that is social. And if the animal finds it reinforcing, or at least that good stress, then yeah, that's social enrichment. So interacting with you, a dog, and other species. The Pueblo Zoo, if you guys have been to the Pueblo Zoo, they have a really super nice reptile area. They have a bull snake that lives with a gopher tortoise. And they would share burrows in nature, so they house them together. So that would be a mixed species exhibit. And I see them laying together. Like there's more than one hide, but oftentimes they're in the same one together. All right. Is she in your sweater now? Okay. Thank you guys very much.